The civil unrest and demonstrations sparked by George Floyd's 2020 murder reignited our awareness of the deep-rooted injustices that people of color experience in America's cities and towns. Since then, the public dialogue has grown. People are engaged in an honest desire to understand systemic discrimination that denies communities of color equal access to housing, public services, and quality of life. As planners, we acknowledge that our profession has contributed to these struggles. This video features the stories of 6 individuals who have been impacted by conditions in their neighborhoods that may be traceable to urban planning decisions.
I liken racism to smoke. And when you walk into a room that is filled with smoke, it's impossible for your hair or your clothing, to go unscathed from that stench of smoke, or to not be touched by it, even if you don't see it or you smell it. And systemic discrimination is just like that, because our founding fathers, God, bless their souls, according to Lin-Manuel Miranda, and I love Hamilton as much as the next person, but a privileging of affluent white men was bound up in that document. And everything since the Constitution has been used to continue to accord privileges and opportunities to white men predominantly, and to institute disadvantages and constrain life chances for people of color and women and other, groups that don't fit into that mold. So in Los Angeles, there's not an area that you can look at that hasn't been touched by systemic discrimination.
Sacramento is probably not unique. There's some communities or neighborhood that are resource deserts, just like we use the term food desert. They're literally resource desert. So for example, the neighborhood that I actually live in, which is called Southeast Village, which is in the southeast portion of Sacramento between Elder Creek Road, Power Inn Road, and 65th. It's pretty limited in terms of some of its resources. So we do have a local community center, but we don't have in our actual neighborhood a library. And to me, libraries are really important because children and families need access to books and literacy, computers. And the infrastructure doesn't always allow for people to walk or ride their bikes to get to some of the services that they need. So in order for the people in the neighborhood that I live in order for me as a parent, when my daughter was growing up, for her to go to the local community center, she had to cross Elder Creek Road, which is somewhat of a busy street, didn't always have stoplights. And I know our neighborhood association really worked hard to get a stoplight where kids from the neighborhood could cross the street to get on the other side of the street to then walk to the community center for swimming lessons and different things like that. So some of the times people don't think about those as resources, but those are critical resources that families really need and depend on and everything.
Even in my own personal history, why did my grandparents move to Crenshaw and Slauson? Was that the choicest neighborhood to move in? Was it the closest to where my grandfather worked in Glendale? No. Was it the closest to where my grandmother cleaned houses in Brentwood? No. But at the time, there were widespread restrictive covenants that prevented my grandparents from purchasing homes in certain areas of the city.
It was a lot of black men, who were unemployed. I call that particular time the white flight. That's when they came up with the GI Bill, when they were paying people to move or relocate or what have you, be able to buy homes. It was a red line, and I didn't understand what was happening back then, but most of our peoples bought homes within Bayview Hunters Point. Some people bought homes down in Double Rock, but the majority of the Caucasian white folks bought homes in other areas.
way that that influences my life today is we own that home, but there is a devaluing of that piece of property because of where it's located, even when the square footage and the location of its proximity to amenities is comparable to communities in other neighborhoods, more affluent communities. There's a historically documented and ongoing devaluing of that property because it's inhabited by African Americans and the Latinx population. Policy environment and the lending environment conspired to systematically devalue property owned by Black people. You know, so and systemic discrimination also influences the nature of gentrification and how market forces are now catering to a more affluent population, and there was no foresight in planning.
What has happened is Oakland values have gone up, sort of property values have gone up, and I think people who are on fixed income, such as my younger siblings, had to move out of the area because they couldn't afford the rent. So now one of my siblings who lives close to me in Sacramento moved out of the Bay Area because she could not afford to pay the rent that's required in the city of Oakland. That at one point in time was a place that, I'm sure it still has families, but the families have to be a very wealthy family in order to stay there, or you're in some area, some pretty sketchy neighborhoods of where you can find some $300,000 homes, but I would not want to raise my family in that neighborhood.
Gentrification is really making some communities not affordable for the very people that live in those communities. And I think sometimes people don't understand that. So I'm going to talk about a community where a lot of people, particularly Black folks in Sacramento, used to live, Oak Park. Historically, Oak Park is where if you're 60 years and older, someone in your family once lived in Oak Park, because Oak Park was the only neighborhood in Sacramento prior to 1950 where Black folks could really live. They couldn't live in other communities, or they couldn't live in other communities and feel safe. And so Oak Park was also a community where it was very affordable to live. The rent wasn't more than $500 or $600. $800 may have been on the expensive end, where you could rent a house, you could purchase a house, you could rent an apartment, you could rent a duplex. And particularly as people from the Bay Area moved to Sacramento, we saw this in other communities. And it forced the rent, we saw the rent really increase. And so it used to be where people in my age group could rent apartments for their young adult children. The young adult children could move there because it was affordable. Now the average cost of rent in Sacramento, no matter where you live, is $1,800 a month for a one-bedroomer. Believe me, that's more than I pay. That's double what I pay for my 4-bedroom house on a half acre. So it makes it really unaffordable for the very community that who lives there. So if you, that's why Sacramento and most communities in California has a crisis of unhoused folks. Folks just are being priced out of housing. They can't afford it. There's not enough. Folks are not making enough money. Folks are not making $15 an hour. They're barely making minimum wage. So they're just priced out of the housing market. Forget about buying a house, but just trying to stay in a house or an apartment or a duplex. So those issues are really triggered by gentrification, low wage, and the pandemic did not help the matter any. I've seen neighborhoods that were predominantly white change. I've seen neighborhoods that were predominantly Black change. And so we've seen gentrification happening in most communities in Sacramento and probably throughout California.
But policy meets market, meets economics, and there in some of the infrastructure investments like the Crenshaw line, which is drastically influencing gentrification in my neighborhood, a planner or environmentalist would say, yes, it's essential that we have light rail to move population so people will get out of their cars. But by taking that policy in a vacuum without considering the racial dynamics, there should have been some type of protections put in place to make sure that property values wouldn't completely balloon, to drive up rents, to drive up the cost of homes, where it's now unaffordable for historic residents of this area who weathered being in that community at a time where there were no amenities, or very few amenities, like, the park not having a pool for 20 plus years. There are other examples, that some of those protections and provisions are embedded into the planning, planning and policy to be mindful of those racial dynamics.
Sacramento Natural Gas Project, where a multinational company wanted to inject gas underneath our homes. The neighborhood, portions of the neighborhood is actually sitting on top of what we call a natural gas reservoir. And a lot of the natural gas have been pumped out, and they wanted to pump it back in. And then, but the challenge was, they were not able to answer a really basic question talking about the health implication. The community in which I live in, it has two extremes. We have very young families, particularly young women of childbearing ages, and then we have a lot of multi-generational families. You have a lot of elderly folks. And so when we would raise the question of how is this going to impact people who are of childbearing age, or even teenagers who, of course, eventually will be of childbearing age, they weren't even able to answer that. Or how would the impact of that gas be on the elderly? It was a 6-year struggle. We didn't have a lot of financial resources, but what we did have were people resources. And we use that as our advantage. And we had a computer, and we took to the sending out emails. We took to sharing our story. But what really was a game changer for us, it was unfortunately at the expense of another neighborhood or community in San Bruno. Many people may have heard about San Bruno, where it was a natural gas explosion. It went national, actually it went international. So when that happened, our story became really real for the average person. They really understood what we were talking about after that. So a 6-year struggle, and we won. It was something, and it makes me, and I always tell people, never give up. Even if we had lost the battle, we won the struggle because we built community, not only locally, but in the region. We were on the right side of justice, particularly environmental justice. And that for me was more important than winning, because the winning part, even though it was a good victory, but it was building our capacity as everyday people. So I learned about gas migration. I never knew about gas migration prior to this process. I really learned how to do more research around environmental justice, how that impacts poor communities, and particularly poor communities of color. We all built our capacity during this particular struggle.
Mi nombre es Rosina Lizárraga. Tengo ya más de 25 años en la comunidad. Empezamos a trabajar en esta comunidad desde 2007. Aquí en Tumiche se trabaja, la comunidad filipina trabaja 10, 12 horas al día. La comunidad latina trabaja casi todo el día. Y llegas a casa y sigues trabajando, y sigues son gente que trabaja mucho tiempo, hasta fines de semana. Entonces, no hay tiempo para estar viéndoles al concilio de la ciudad decir, esto es lo que necesita mi comunidad. O no hay interés porque piensa que nadie te va a escuchar. Piensas que tú y tu comunidad no lo van a hacer. Entonces, como líder de la ciudad, vimos qué es lo que vamos a hacer nosotros. Yo como mamá de familia, como kitchenista, como líder de comunidad empoderada, ¿qué es lo que vas a hacer ya a nivel gubernamental? ¿Cómo vas a poner la voz de esa gente? Entonces, cuando está en una comunidad donde te sientes a gusto, es cuando empieza el interés. Entonces, cuando yo empecé a tener los niños en la escuela, me atrajo mucho que había demasiada comida. Le llamamos, porque antes se llamaba Rancho de la Nación y le denominaron National City, por lo mismo, porque era una comunidad donde se sembraba frutos y se exportaba frutos a todo el país. Nosotros como mamás y jefes de familia, a veces también por la rapidez de la sociedad o porque estás muy ocupado con tus deudas o con tus cosas, o porque dejaste un pasado y te viniste a otra ciudad, porque migraste de un país a otro, ese sentido se pierde y pierdes también la noción del por qué no hacer las cosas, del por qué no te involucras. Yo me acuerdo que mi mamá estaba encima de nosotros en la escuela y de repente dije, yo no voy a las juntas de mis hijos. Y eso me dio pauta a pensar de que algo teníamos que hacer. Entonces nos juntamos todas las mamás y empezamos a ver que los fines eran los mismos. Comida, transporte y estado emocional. Entonces se corrió un programa empezamos a hacer una coalición. Cuando te gradúas del programa de Cooking for Salud que establece a Hollywood Gardens, te gradúas de un programa y te nombran kitchenistas porque eres especialista en la cocina. Por eso es un término corto y se llama kitchenista porque eres kitchen especialista. Empecé a indagar a ver qué íbamos a hacer no tanto con la comida de la escuela, sino con lo que la ciudad provee o cómo la ciudad está estructurada. Pero vimos que no era una cosa es la equidad, otra cosa es la igualdad. Entonces estamos en igualdad, pero no en equidad. Entonces logramos demostrar que no había accesibilidad a comida saludable. Era una tiendita que estaba en el barrio nada más y era todo procesado, enlatado. Entonces vimos que no estaba la comunidad para caminar ni accesar al parque. No había amenidades como para hacer ejercicio. Los gimnasios estaban muy lejos y demasiado caros. O no se sentían seguros en tu misma calle caminando. Y los papás siempre estaban trabajando, les daban dinero a los hijos y iban a comprar comida accesible con sodas. $20, $25 que tenían los niños iban a comprar a la tiendita de esquina. Entonces nos pusimos a trabajar y a colaborar de cómo se trajeron una afiliación de la San Diego State en psicología, a ver cómo podíamos hacer un subgrupo en la escuela para ver cómo se podía colaborar. Entonces llegó el condado, llegó la facultad de psicología, llegó a clínicas de aquí de San Isidro, la clínica de aquí de National City, también llegó una agencia que es la National City Family Resource Center, que es el centro de recursos de National City. Entonces todos nos juntamos a ver por qué estaban pasando esas cosas. Y los niños no mostraban mucha de los beneficios que queríamos para ellos. Entonces después vimos que era cómo estaba estructurada la ciudad. Entonces, gracias a la intervención de eso, la ciudad nos escuchó por medio del departamento de policía, tuvimos mucho apoyo. La ciudad nos explicó, vino un ingeniero de la ciudad y se dio cuenta de que nosotros éramos los que estamos pidiendo en la calle, como estaba estructurada, la gente no se paraba, nos estaba teniendo que poner como topes para que redujera la velocidad y el clima en la escuela se tornó diferente, porque los ingenieros de la ciudad vinieron a ver qué pasaba y por qué estaba tanta problemática. Entonces dedujimos que era la colaboración. La colaboración siempre es bien importante.
So for me, I think city planning has a lot to do with community support, community understanding. We were talking about how I would see, or what I would like to see the city planners do, and how you can break into maybe the conversation of the neighborhood. Part of it is building the trust, right? As a planner or as an outsider, whatever you might call it, you come into a community, there's going to be people who kind of represent the community, people who talk to the community through them, right? A messaging system, quote, say, or spokesperson. I think part of it has to do with, in immersing yourself in that community, not just visit it one time, but, making it a multiple efforts, maybe even have a potluck, a community potluck dinner, whatever it might be, just so that you get to learn who they are. You get to learn what their wants are. Sometimes city planners already have an idea of what it is that they've been told to do, either by the developer or whomever is the financier, but at the same time, if you're going to be going about fixing the neighborhood, you're going about providing, amenities for the neighborhood. I think part of it has to do with listening to what amenities the community thinks they might have or might need. What do they say? You may not always get what you want, but you get what you need. But I think the important key is to express what that need is.
For the developers, what I would like to say is we, the community are not bad. We don't have anything against the developers. It's just that sometimes developers don't see the same visions that we have. And so what I'm doing is I'd like to take this moment to invite the developers to come out to the community, or even if it's through Zoom right now because of the pandemic. Invite the community through Zoom, and when you're able to hold meetings, invite the community to these meetings so that way you can see how we could work with you, because this is the community that we live in. You guys work for the community, but you actually don't live in the community. And this is my way of saying, come out and listen and hear about what we have to say, because we're not against you. We just want you to work with us. And in return, you will see that the community will work for you.
What do you think planners can do to support the community?
More business opportunities. Like I said, when I was growing up, we had about 4 or 5 black cleaners. We had Finley's Funeral Home. We had Fuller's Drugstore.
Mm-hmm.
We need businesses like that.
So more economic development.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And training programs to train people in the different fields. Mm-hmm.
We don't necessarily need to operate with shouldering the blame, but instead we can feel that our ancestors bequeath us with the responsibility to address these circumstances. And I think a hope is to muster the courage to no longer, deflect and say it was a different time, or, planning only has this small role, but instead rise to the occasion to remedy these issues. And our lives are not one-dimensional. Our built environment and community development can't be done with only one sector. So while planning is working on its own solutions, it has to be done in concert with people in the economic and workforce development field, people in policy and legislative spaces, because some of this will need to involve policy that does take the form of reparations. A planning document, a housing element, for instance, can't afford a carve out of a subsidy to Black homeowners. But planners can make the argument that these are some of the ways that land use has influenced the inability of Black people to own homes, and then work collaboratively to adopt policies that can rectify that harm. Another hope is that, like some of the work that we do in Watts, is that we will center the voices of those most harmed by the policies, and that they become the experts. We need to make sure that communities are centered and that communities provide that expertise in what plans and policies we should adopt that can help them get to a better place of opportunity and well-being, and to not just survive but to thrive.
Really work to address systemic racism and issues that really impact all of our lives, but particularly poor folks' lives. I think that's the most important thing that we see in the campaign, that we have a term, we have to unite the poor, but we have to fight poverty, not the poor.
This video has been produced by the California Planning Roundtable, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing planning through innovation and leadership. We seek to understand the consequences of past planning decisions and to help planners and decision makers ensure our future actions do not perpetuate past and present inequities. Our participants have described the injustices they have experienced. Moreover, they have offered suggestions to help us improve how we serve our communities. These interviews represent their unique stories. We hope to conduct additional interviews capturing many more stories and viewpoints from around the state. Thank you for joining.